This is MichMash, a weekly conversation where we try to unjumble an important and sometimes under-the-radar statewide story that affects you. I'm Cheyna Roth.
And I'm Zach Gorchow.
Zach, I think it's safe to say this has been a rough week for Jocelyn Benson, the Secretary of State and frontrunner for the Democratic gubernatorial nomination. Attorney General Dana Nessel found she violated the Michigan Campaign Finance Act. What happened?
Well, Cheyna, the Michigan Secretary of State, besides handling our driver's licenses and vehicle tabs, also runs the state's election system. That means Jocelyn Benson's in charge of enforcing the Michigan Campaign Finance Act, which regulates how much money candidates for state office can raise, how they can spend it, and it puts up a wall designed to prevent government resources, everything from staff to facilities, from contributing to political campaigns.
So if the Secretary of State enforces this law and hands down penalties to violators, it stands to reason the Secretary of State should follow the statute to the letter, especially if the Secretary of State is running for higher office and any violations of their own would become fodder for their opponents.
I think you can see where this is going, I'm guessing.
I do, but continue.
So in January, Benson announced her candidacy for governor. And as part of her rollout, she held a press conference in the Richard H. Austin building in Lansing. That's the building that houses Secretary of State offices. At the event, reporters asked Benson about holding a campaign event in a government building, given the aforementioned Michigan Campaign Finance Act's prohibition on the use of state resources for campaign purposes. Benson explained that because of the cold, it was freezing that day. She didn't want to have the event outside. Further, she noted that any other candidate was free to do the same in the building, meaning it would be legal.
Right. Now, I remember in the summer of 2024, President Trump held a campaign event at the Livingston County Sheriff's Office in Howell. Democrats filed a complaint about it, arguing the same violation of using a government building for political purposes. But Benson's Secretary of State staff dismissed it after the sheriff's office said other candidates could use the building and the Trump campaign paid a modest rental fee.
Benson's argument about how other candidates are free to use the Austin building for campaign events got slapped down by Nessel, however. The Department of Attorney General handles campaign finance complaints against secretaries of state because there would be an obvious conflict of interest in the Secretary of State investigating herself. Nessel's staff noted that Benson doesn't own the Austin building, even though it's her staff there. The State Department of Technology, Management, and Budget owns the building. And DTMB, as it's known here in Lansing, which owns all the state departmental buildings, has a very clear policy against partisan events in those buildings.
Ouch. Okay, I'm curious, Zach. A lot of people listening to this might be inclined to find this all, I'm going to say boring. Okay, I mean, Benson used a building, so what's the big deal? Who is really going to remember this in a year and change when it's time to vote? So as part of the MichMash promise to explain why things matter to listeners, break that down for us.
So there's one really obvious piece, which is this is a Democrat versus Democrat squabble. Dana Nessel is a Democrat. Jocelyn Benson is a Democrat. And Nessel's department finding that Benson violated the law has to sting. There's no chance for Benson to say this is just a partisan attack. Next, this immediately became fodder for the 2026 election cycle. Benson's the Democratic frontrunner for governor, and that means Republicans, surprise, are looking for any opportunity to attack Benson's job performance as Secretary of State. No surprise here, they were all over this. Third, the law does exist for a reason. Prevent government officials from using taxpayer resources for political purposes. Benson's campaign should have rented a facility to hold this press conference. The cost to taxpayers was, well, zero, to your point, but Republicans will argue that Benson conveniently ignored the law she's supposed to enforce when it came to her own activities.
I found it interesting that while Republican elected officials, candidates, and operatives mobilized to use this against Benson, I mean, they just jumped on it, it was crickets from Benson's two actual opponents in the Democratic primary for governor, Lieutenant Governor Garland Gilchrist and Chris Swanson, the Genesee County Sheriff. Also, biting his tongue on this was the independent candidate, Detroit Mayor Mike Duggan. What do you make of that?
So Swanson and Duggan have said they are planning not to attack in this campaign. And it's so early that the only thing using this against Benson would do is really raise the hackles of the most attuned Democratic voters and operatives. That would potentially hurt Swanson. And Mike Duggan, he's saying he's a different kind of candidate. If he goes negative now, that argument's kind of going to fall away. So that being said, they have probably filed this one away for use at a later date if needed. Gilchrist probably falls into the same camp, though he has been so quiet overall since announcing his campaign for governor. It's hard to draw any conclusions about where he's at.
Well, as if getting rung up on a campaign finance violation wasn't enough, Benson and her department are also getting in trouble for a failure of a technology firm the state hired to deploy a new system for the public to view how candidates and PACs or political action committees raise and spend money, what lobbyists spend, and personal finance disclosure forms for elected officials. What is all of this about?
I mean, the Secretary of State is in charge of the system that has all of these key transparency pieces. And they have been under fire, Benson and her department, for a month for the failure to launch of this new system. Now, ordinarily, this wouldn't be terribly politically potent, but Benson's early campaign emphasis has been government transparency. And the floundering of this system, there is so much key information that traditionally has been available to the public that is now gone, at least for now. It is a bad look. That said, if they can get this operational and working well in the next 8 weeks before gubernatorial candidates like Benson file their first real campaign finance statements of the year, this will fade away into the rear view. But if they don't have the system working by then...
well, hoo boy, look out. Well, we are going to switch gears, and after this short break, we're going to talk to Democratic House Leader Ranjeev Puri. Stick around.
Hey MichMash familia, it's Hernz Laguerre Jr., producer of MichMash. Before we get to the rest of the show, I just want to share some news. MichMash won second place in the Michigan Press Association Awards for Best Podcast. I want to give a special shout out to our host, WDET's Cheyna Roth and Gongwer News Services' Zach Gorchow and Alethea Casbin. And most importantly, we want to thank you, our listeners. Without you, there wouldn't be a MichMash. You guys are literally the mish to the mash. We'd be sharing deep analysis and random factoids about different stories into the nothingness of space if it wasn't for you guys. But luckily, we don't have to worry about that. As Michigan continues to step into the national spotlight, we're going to continue to bring you under the radar and statewide stories that affect you. And now, back to your regularly scheduled programming.
Welcome back to MichMash. I'm Zach Gorchow. Joining us now is State Representative Ranjeev Puri, a Canton Township Democrat who this year was the choice of his fellow Democrats in the Michigan House to lead them as Minority Leader. Leader Puri, welcome to MichMash.
Zach, thanks for having me. Big fan. Glad to be on.
Well, we're glad to have you here. So let's go with a 50,000-foot view to start. What, in your view, is the most important development we have seen at the Capitol this year?
I think it's the lack of progress that's being made. Right now we are at a crossroads for what the vision of Michigan could be. I know myself, House Democrats in Lansing are invested in a vision that invests in Michigan, that invests in people, invests in our institutions, invests in our kids, invests just in the people of Michigan, broadly speaking. But the reality is I think that there are actors that are just engaging in political theater and want to cut from these programs and just not take a serious approach to just the role of governing. And so that has resulted in, I think, only 4 public acts so far in the first 5-6 months, and making it one of the least productive legislatures in the last 50 years. And so my hope is that we can start to work on that.
It doesn't sound like you and the Speaker of the House have much of a working relationship. Can you talk about why that is, and is there anything that you can do about that?
I'm not a reporter. I'm not President Trump. I don't think he has much interest in talking to me. But jokes aside, I think, again, Speaker Hall is engaged in being an actor of political theater. I am taking a much more pragmatic approach here. I understand that we are in split government, and so as much as Speaker Hall wants to shout from the mountaintops that everything that he says must be the holy gospel. The reality is that him and his party do not have the votes to make public acts. Public acts do not originate and finish in the House alone. The Democrats do control the state Senate and the EOG office. And so my hope is, again, that there will be real bipartisan work that's bicameral that actually makes it across the finish line. And then until that changes, those dynamics won't change.
So let's kind of flash back to November of last year. The election is held, Republicans win majority, and then leadership elections take place. Matt Hall, state representative from Kalamazoo County, is elected the speaker, and the House Democrats elect you as the minority leader. Did the two of you break bread, so to speak, or did this just sort of go sour kind of quickly or go nowhere quickly? However, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you tell me.
Yeah. I don't know how I would characterize everything in terms of breaking bread and the friendliness. There was a handful of conversations early on. I think that there was an attempt, at least on my part, to try to formulate something better. We had talked about a relationship that was healthier. But again, the reality is that the way things have played out, that's just not been something that the speaker has been interested in pursuing.
So given that Democrats used to have power in all the chambers and now the House Democrats lost control of their chamber, how have negotiations gone? Is it in some ways maybe easier to negotiate with Republicans because you know where they stand and you aren't effectively negotiating against yourself, unlike kind of what seemed to be happening at the tail end of last year?
I think negotiations have been fairly non-existent. I think there hasn't been meaningful dialogue. Like I said, there hasn't been very many conversations between the speaker and myself. And so the reality is, and again, I'm going to keep harping on this, is that just because Speaker Hall says something does not make it truth. Just because Speaker Hall has an initiative does not make it a public act. For things to get done, there has to be real bipartisanship. That is just the reality of split government. And there just hasn't been a cadence set up to make that dynamic actually work or fit. And so I think until that changes, we're going to see the gridlock that we've been seeing.
Do you feel isolated at all from the governor and the Senate Majority Leader when he brings? You had voted against the legislation that's slowed some aspects of the minimum wage and paid sick time laws that ended up passing the House and then passing the Senate. Brings back the changes. Whitmer signed them, but you voted against both.
Yeah, I know we're not isolated at all. I think we have a healthy rapport. I talk to the Senate Majority Leader all the time. I talk to the governor all the time. And the reality is that we do want to find a way to make things work in Michigan, and we're ready to have those conversations. And just because you're the same party does not mean that you need to agree 100% of the time. I think that is actually a sign of a healthy relationship. And that actually applies to my caucus as well. We empower our caucus members to vote their district, to have their own opinions. And I think that's one thing that makes our caucus and our party really special. And so, no, I think we actually have a great rapport, and we try to meet often and regularly.
So how do you get something going with the speaker? And I say you, it's like the royal you, the governor, yourself, the Senate Majority Leader, because at some point there are a couple things, the budget most of all, that do need to happen. And right now it feels like the speaker is doing his thing with the House, and the governor and the Senate Majority Leader, and maybe yourself and the House Democrats too, are sort of like, what do we even do with this?
It's just going to come down to when the speaker wants to be serious about governing. If the goal is to continue to get social media clicks and to be best buddies with Donald Trump and to get as many appearances on stage with Donald Trump, that is one goal, that is one vision. But if the speaker ever wants to use the proximity he has to the president to actually stand up for Michiganders, then we can find a way to have those bipartisan wins to get the budget done. The reality is that a budget must get done. There is no reason for us to be slow playing this. These are all self-inflicted problems and wounds. Like the speaker's making us trip over ourselves right now. I'm not understanding if there's, trying to co-opt the DC way of doing things, but there's a distinct difference of being the president of the United States of America and being Matt Hall. And so what I think needs to happen is there just needs to be a more serious approach to actually finding a way to get things done. There's real world consequences to not getting a budget done on time. I think Speaker Hall might think that this makes for cool headlines and whatever other motives he has for delaying this. But if we don't get a school aid budget done on time, that means that there's going to be hundreds of pink slips for teachers this summer in districts across the state. And I know when I was growing up, and summer was obviously a great part of the school year, being on summer break. But when it was time to go back to school, you started buying school supplies. You'd go to the store with your mom or dad, and they'd pick out embarrassing outfits, new outfits for school. And then, there was that magic day when you found out who your teacher was going to be. And you'd come home and then you'd call all your buddies and kind of compare who has what teacher. And that was just a really fun thing to do and look forward to. Now you can imagine that if that teacher that you identified might be fired, might not be around. And it doesn't need to be this way. It's because one man doesn't want to do his job. And so I think, and then on top of that, there's just the looming cuts that are coming federally. I think recently our federal counterparts passed a bill in D.C. that's going to just be really destructive to the financial outlook of the state of Michigan. There's going to be billions of dollars of federal cuts that come to Michigan. I haven't seen the specific numbers, but I know that is going to lead to hospitals closing around the state, to nursing homes closing around the state, SNAP benefits, Title I programs, and just, the billions of dollars that are dependent on state programs that come from federal monies are just not going to be there. And then the state, unfortunately, doesn't have the funds to backfill that. And so we could be having conversations on how do we fix that, or we can continue to just take up votes on very unnecessary bills that don't actually do anything. And again, this unserious approach that Speaker Hall is taking with these dangerous consequences.
So kind of speaking of budget, on Wednesday, Democratic Senator Sarah Anthony, she did something a little unusual. She went on the House floor to talk to reporters, and she was responding to House Resolution 113, which called on the Senate to recall the budget it passed last week, claiming it was unbalanced. Where do you stand on this fight?
Again, it's not a fight. It's an unserious approach to just to governing. Just zero out the Senate budgets like it's always done, and we can fix the issue if there is an issue. I haven't talked to Senator Anthony, and I'm not understanding the conversations that she has, but she knows the budget. She's let me remind you, she was the budget chair when the budget passed on time. The last 2 years, and so she knows what she's doing, and so I think these are just distractions. These are an unserious approach by Speaker Hall and House Republicans to just distract from real conversations. I've already highlighted there's a whole host of things that we should be doing to protect Michiganders. From the tariffs, the economic uncertainty, the correct numbers. There's a lot of problems headed Michigan's way, but here we are continuing to talk and fill the room with distractions and just an unserious approach.
So Speaker Hall, as you know, he looks for places where he has leverage. We saw that at the end of last year. We've seen it really on many occasions. Does he have it on the budget? Because if the budget gets into a brinksmanship type situation at the end of September, it feels like, given his caucus wants to see spending reduced, that might give them a bit of an advantage. Or am I wrong?
I think there's a lot of ways that this could play out. I don't think Speaker Hall is going to have the leverage on the budget that he may think he has, but the reality is like it's sheer numbers. I was the majority whip last term. So one thing I can do is count votes, and the reality is that when you have the 56-21 formula, the numbers aren't there for Republicans lancing to do it themselves. And so, again, the budget has to be truly bipartisan. It has to be bicameral in order to get done. And as much as Speaker Hall wants to think that he can solve all of Lansing's problems by himself, that's just not mathematically possible.
And Hall's also said that the House Republican majority will not support a budget for the next fiscal year unless it reduces spending from the current year in a meaningful way. Are Democrats prepared to go in that direction? And I guess, how do you guys untie this knot that is happening? And as you say, I mean, you really can't govern very well without a budget.
Well, it's not only about untying a knot. It's about not making the knot bigger and worse than it needs to be. Again, there is a way to pass a baseline budget. The money is there right now to just keep things operating. Anything to not do that is destructive and just self-inflicting kind of just more damage and harm. There are probably going to be cuts because of the federal monies that aren't going to be coming to Michigan. So some of those might happen a little bit more organically. But again, there are two visions we can have here. There is one in which we are actually investing in our kids and feeding our kids and not forcing them to go hungry and not get breakfast and lunch at school. There's one where we invest in our teachers and our youth and are not giving them pink slips. There's one where we are keeping hospitals open and not forcing people to drive hours away to get their health care. What I guess is just confusing to me is House Democrats and Democrats around Lansing are very proudly saying that we do not want our hospitals to close. We want to make sure that people can go to the doctor when they need to go to the doctor. We do not want our kids to go hungry. Why do Republicans want hospitals to close? Why do Republicans want to fire teachers? That, I think, is the essence and the values that we're trying to decipher right now. And so when you talk about untangling the knot, my question to you is why are they tangling the knot even more? Why are they making the knot even bigger?
Shift gears to the federal level a little bit. So President Trump has been in office for more than 100 days, and it still feels like Democrats nationally are struggling to figure out how to deal with this, rally an effective response. You're one of kind of the new vanguard of Democratic leaders, certainly in Michigan. What do you think the Democratic Party should be doing right now?
I think that the Democratic Party should be standing up for the people of Michigan. That we came off of a very robust election cycle, like Zach mentioned, in 2024. And the message was very clear what the voters wanted. They wanted, just more of an economic agenda. They wanted people to make sure that we are investing in them. We're seeing evidence in some of the work that we did in the Democratic trifecta actually working from the last correct numbers and the results of the EITC programs and the pension tax, and how that's actually getting money into the people's pockets who actually need it. And I think that's what we need to be doing. I think the time for partisanship is over. And so that's why, it's deeply confusing to understand why Matt Hall continues to want to make things very partisan and continue to make us play out political theater here, when really just we should be investing in the people of Michigan. And so, it's not so much about Donald Trump and what he is or isn't doing. It's just about finding ways to stand up and protect Michiganders. Look, the reality is it's clear to see that I don't agree with the approach that the current administration is taking. But I think it's a more value-based thing. I said House Democrats do not want hospitals to close. House Democrats want to make sure that nursing homes remain open. If that's somehow now a partisan conversation, then so be it. Characterize it as a partisan conversation. But in order to respond to Donald Trump, we need to be standing up to Michigan. When one guy is just thinking that it's cool to start an economic trade war, a trade war that we're losing, by the way, just because he thinks it sounds cool, it's going to disproportionately affect Michigan. We know that our agriculture sector is suffering right now because of this failed tariff plan. So many orders have been canceled. They're seeing buyer's remorse in rural parts of Michigan that are deeply committed and highly conservative. The other reality is that our automotive industry is also disproportionately going to be affected. We are not other parts of the country like Oklahoma and Alabama, where maybe tariffs sound cool over there. Over here, tariffs are deeply unpopular. And it's because we have a very trade-rich border with an international trading partner in Canada. And then we also have a very robust trade partnership with Mexico, who are trade allies of ours, who have been trade allies of ours, who business models in Michigan have been set up to have trading partnerships with. And so I guess, again, what is confusing is if Speaker Hall has this proximity to Trump and likes to get on stage with President Trump and put his arm around President Trump, why isn't he using that proximity to stand up for the people of Michigan? Why isn't he telling President Trump that these tariffs are disproportionately affecting Michigan, that these looming cuts from Medicaid and these federal cuts are going to also impact millions of Michiganders and take away their ability to go seek health care? And so, again, the way you stand up and fight against Trump as Democrats is you show up and you find ways to invest in the people of Michigan, not take things away from them.
Let's close out with a look at 2026. It seems like it's far away. It's really not. Have you decided who you're supporting for governor and U.S. Senate? And will you tell us?
No and no, but the reality is I have one singular focus, and it's getting House Democrats back into the majority. I made a promise to my colleagues to get them their gavels back in their hands, and that's what I'm committed to doing. And I'm going to be willing to partner with whoever the Democratic nominee is, as long as they're committed to making sure that we're getting the Michigan House back into the control of Democrats.
Well, Leader Puri, thank you so much for joining us on MichMash this week, and wish you all the best.
Thanks so much for having me.